Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Stebbins. I work here at the Institute of World Politics as the Director of Graduate Recruitment, but I'm also an IWP alum. And I want to thank you all for coming today. We would like to sincerely welcome you to the Institute. We are an independent, specialized graduate school focusing on statecraft, national security, and international affairs. And today's event will be off the record. I would like to introduce our panel today, who will discuss special operations forces and diplomacy. Starting with Ambassador Charlie Ray, is the former U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe and Cambodia. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW and Missing Personnel Affairs. Jesse Lee, down at the end, is the Principal for the Institute for the Management of Conflict, and who participates in humanitarian development and stabilization operations and is a former member of SEAL Team 2. And then Glenn Pangelinan in the center is the founder of the Reliance Project, an organization that combats human trafficking, sex slavery, and child soldiering, and is a former naval intelligence officer assigned to SEAL Teams 2, 8, and 10, amongst many other things. For anyone who's interested in graduate school here at the Institute after the event, myself and some of my staff will be around to speak with you. Please feel free to approach us and ask any questions. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to the panel and to David Marimi, who is a current student here at the Institute and who helped put this panel on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. That comes with a good afternoon, David. All right. Just to make sure you guys are up. Really at the base of everything, the reason why we're here is honestly to figure out what is the connection between special operations and our diplomatic corps. I want you guys to, as we discuss and talk about this, and I want you guys to feel free to, pose questions as we discuss. This is going to be a very open and free discussion. I've been to plenty of panels and usually the Q&A afterwards, but we're here to be challenged, and we're here to challenge you, hopefully, in a nutshell. We want to discuss what most people don't know are the roles of not only our special operations, but what the combination between our special operations and our diplomatic corps. We also want to explain to you the importance of having special operations. And I think what Hollywood and what we kind of know as the mystique of special operations, we kind of want to flip the script, if I can say that, on its head and kind of give you a curtail of what really these guys do on a daily basis in the field and here in the homeland. And we kind of want to give you guys also some personal testimony. So I've been to plenty of panels. I've slept at many panels. This is not going to be one of them. There's a saying in the United States Foreign Service, pale, male, and Yale is usually what represents our country abroad. And as you can see here, not only do we have a diverse panel, but we have hopefully what represents the United States in their professional experience as well, which is obviously most important. So without further ado, I'd like to turn on the panel to these fine gentlemen, and feel free to ask any questions at any time as we discuss here in the next 45 minutes. I appreciate you guys coming and being in attendance, and hope you get a humanistic feel of what we do and what we can do, hopefully, in the future. Thank you, guys. I want to start with Ambassador Charlie Ray, and he can kind of start and introduce himself, and then we'll follow down the line.
Yeah, I guess they have to let me go first, being the oldest. They're never sure if I'll make it through the whole panel. I spent 20 years in the Army, and then I got out of the Army, and rather than getting a job, I spent the next 30 years as a diplomat. And I retired 4 years ago. Now, those of you who are good at math, if you've done that quickly, you know why I'm going first, because I might not make it through the panel. During my time in the Army, though, I was a commander twice once of a special operations unit, a psychological operations detachment. Worked a lot with embassies and embassy personnel. When I left the Army and joined the Foreign Service, rising up through the ranks, over the 30-year career, I probably had to work very closely with the military at least a dozen, maybe even 24 times in both routine sort of day-to-day operations and emergency type operations. And comparing those two experiences, I mean, the one thing I want to say, it's sort of in line with this panel, is comparing working with special operations units or soft forces and working with regular military forces. Most embassies prefer the former, and I'll explain why in a minute. Working with the military or the military and our embassies abroad working together today, you hear a little about it in the news. Usually you only hear about it in the news when something goes wrong, and what you hear, I can tell you, 95% of the time is so wrong in the way they report it that my advice is ignore it. But what I notice in working with military organizations and diplomatic organizations since I retired in 2012 is that the problems, the challenges, the issues are a little different today in that back in the 60s and 70s, for example, Vietnam, until Vietnam ended in 1975, our embassies in Southeast Asia and the military worked fairly closely together. Some places well, some places like Laos not so well. Later in places like Grenada and in other places, the relationship waxed and waned. I worked with the embassy very closely in Korea after Vietnam in the 1970s as the commander of the psychological operations unit. Very good relationship. After leaving the military, joining the Foreign Service, my relationship with the military continued in a sense. What you read about now over the last decade, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, are a bit different. They're close to, but not quite the same as Vietnam. What is not appearing in the press very much is that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the activity, the joint activity that's going on worldwide between the Department of Defense organizations of DoD and our embassies and missions abroad. In some places, those relationships work very well. In some places, not so well. I won't comment on Afghanistan and Iraq. When I worked at the Department of Defense, I did that often enough until I was banned from attending meetings. But I will say this, what I see today, while the challenges today, the big thing is fighting terrorism in the press. Actually, the real big issues that don't seem to get a lot of headlines are fighting international crime, human trafficking, transnational diseases, movement of people caused by crises, either man-made or natural. And this has challenged both our DoD units abroad and our embassies abroad in ways not seen before. But there are some things that I know haven't changed. Two things in particular, and I've been working with some both official and unofficial committees for the last 4 years on this. The two issues that still face us, that have faced us since the end of World War II, are that the civilians in our embassies abroad and our civilian foreign affairs organizations here in Washington do not know how to communicate with the military in a way that the military can then translate that into operational plans. And the second, the military has yet to come to grips with an understanding of what Chief of Mission Authority truly means. And I won't go into, because that's a whole other lecture. But those two issues existed in the 60s. They existed ever since President Eisenhower issued the first Chief of Mission letter, making his representatives abroad the senior U.S. government officials in a country with authority over everyone in that country except military forces engaged in Title X operations under a geographic commander. It wasn't understood well back then when Eisenhower issued the first letter, And I can assure you, as of about 14 months ago, when I was on a training exercise, I do a training contract with the U.S. Army preparing their units to go overseas. I was on a training exercise about 14 months ago with a unit out in Fort Irwin, California. It exists today. Military organizations, commanders at all levels, from privates all the way up to four-star generals, still do not understand that phrase, Chief of Mission Authority, what it means and what it implies. The civilians that they have to work with still do not know how to communicate with them in ways that they understand. And that is the crux of it. The exception to that, and I will stop talking and let these two other gentlemen wake you back up again, is that most of our special operations forces, with a few exceptions, have a better understanding of the intricacies of dealing with a diplomatic mission than traditional military units do. SOF, by its very nature, is unconventional, is able to how shall I say this, operate outside the box.
No rules.
Well, I wouldn't say no rules. Rules, but rules as guidelines, not as hard. In the SOF community, the rules are there more as painted lines on the road, not fences that you can't cross. In a traditional unit, and I'll give you an example. Well, I'll give you two examples, and then I'll stop. I worked with a special operations unit on the case of three contractors who were held captive for 5 years in Colombia by the FARC. The special operations units were very flexible in terms of where they were willing to put their people in order to gather information to be able to formulate a plan to work with the Colombians to mount what was ultimately a successful recovery operation. That would never have happened with a U.S. Army division. There's no way the Division G2 would have allowed any of its people to do what the Special Operations Command allowed their operators to do. On the other side of the fence, my last trip to Fort Irwin, I worked with an armored cavalry regiment training to go overseas, and one of the exercises was they were to send a company in to secure a consulate, to use it as a staging base for evacuating civilians from the area. They were told either the ambassador or the deputy chief of mission will be there to meet you when you land. You are to make yourself available to him to secure this movement so American civilians in this area can be brought to the consulate, documented, and brought out. The young captain in charge of the unit, the helicopters fly in, my security officer, my staff, we're waiting on the consulate compound. Their helicopters land, they march through these streets, they come to the fence. Apparently someone had given them the wrong map coordinates because they came to the section of the fence that didn't have the gate in it where we were waiting. So they knocked a hole in the fence and came through. And when I roared up screaming at the young captain with my finger in his face, he gave me a bit of attitude, and he was a bit shocked when he found himself wrestled to the ground by my RSO and my security team. How dare you threaten the ambassador? You can't do that. And of course, his troops are all standing there with their jaws on their chest, like, what in the hell is going on? And I gave them a little lecture on Chief of Mission Authority. But that's, and sadly, I have to say, sadly, that was an exercise. I have actually encountered an identical almost situation in a real life overseas situation with a commander, with an officer a lot more senior than a captain. And so those are the two issues that argue for there will always be a need for our diplomatic establishments and the military to work together. The world's gotten so complex that we can't either side go it alone. But there's still a compelling need for us to learn how to do it better. And hopefully in today's presentation we can talk about that a little.
So I've was in the Navy for 20 years and never served as a diplomat anywhere other than under a chief of mission, chief of station, who was usually a CIA authority at the embassy. And my education of the world took place, 16 years ago, when the Navy thought they needed to have more people of color in the special operations realm, and specifically in the intelligence realm. And so I've got, I'm originally from Guam, so the affirmative action thing doesn't apply. So when I showed up, it was just kind of funny. I was like, well, if you think I'm qualified because of my color, I thought it was a joke. I went and here I was in the intelligence world and got pushed to the SEAL teams, and this was something that I didn't think about until I was in Bosnia in 2001 to 2002, and my job was to find persons indicted for war crimes and resettle refugees and exhume mass grave sites. And through those experiences, I saw the product of war and what it was like, and then later on I saw war itself in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and I thought of those experiences in Bosnia. And the one thing that resonated very well was the fact that, and I have this book in front of me. I like David Kilcullen's book where he said that most in the world in colonization saw that when a white person showed up, 2 others would show up, and then 3, and then as colonization, it was bad, and there was no positive result. And it was different when I showed up because they were just confused as to why I showed up. And I was American. And the first 30-minute conversation was how I was educated in American University, and I got a master's, and I was a chief petty officer. So when the SEAL teams referred to me as chief, I thought I was in charge, so I thought it was comical. I wasn't in charge. But then we started having a conversation about how they were president and I was president, and I had never met Bush or Clinton or anyone like it. And so we would start talking about development pieces and what really mattered to them. And it would range from anything from child soldiering to kidnapping to forced sex slavery, things that you're not trained to deal with in the special operations community. And so we were just this group of 9 SEALs and a intelligence guy who was brown, talking about how we can improve their lives and how we can mitigate some of these concerns and why the U.S. government sent me, et cetera, et cetera. And the bottom line was, insurgencies were created because someone didn't have some representation in government, or something basic life was removed from the way they lived. And so once we mitigated those concerns, then we can now consolidate efforts in the State Department, USAID side. Now we can have key leader engagements, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was my experience in Bosnia. It was my experience in Iraq and the Al-Anbar uprising. People think of SEAL teams as kinetic, and I was the guy who was in charge of targeting everyone around Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, anyone who dealt with weapons or finance or trafficking of women who were sold to fund terrorism. Those were my targets. So if American Sniper was a new movie that came out, Fanous was talked about, that was my target specifically. That was what I created when I was in Ramadi. And then again in Chad, we're training Chadian Special Forces guys. We find ourselves in Nigeria, in Kano, Majiguri, talking about human trafficking and what that meant to the terrorism space. It's not a military issue, it's a civil issue. We ignore it. But yet this is something that is a serious concern of theirs. And so the best we could do at the moment was child soldiering. And in Chad, they had at least 13 or so 9 to 16-year-old kids that were part of the outfit that they called Special Operations Soldiers, part of the training attachment that we were sent. And so I managed to get them through conversation in the kitchen. I was figured what? These guys can't shoot very well. They need to start cooking first. And cooking led to classroom, and eventually classroom led to them not being soldiers anymore. But I never found myself pointing fingers at them in the faults that they had, or putting my policies on them. It was always just making stuff up based on their body language. Same thing transpired in Afghanistan. You sent me to Talib territories. Same principle. These are cattlemen. They're also Talibs part-time. what in their life makes them tick. So we bring a veterinarian out there, we're delivering babies, we're human. It's just something that you're not expecting as a special operations intelligence person. And so my job was, although it was intelligence by trade, it was really gaining access by creating whatever model of development and humanitarian event that I can create in a $50,000 level. It wasn't a lot of money that we could do to make an impact in that world that would give access to the U.S. government on the U.S. state and USAID side. And that leads to federal opportunities that a lot of NGOs here realize in FedBizOps or grants. That all comes from what most don't know is intelligence information that comes from guys like us in the frontier markets. And so I think the reason we wanted to do this panel was because this is a intelligence-focused entity, and intelligence isn't about targeting individuals to affect the space in the way you want it to. I think it's really important to affect the space in the way they want you to, and not lay your policies on them. And that's the reason why I think in all the dynamic situations I've been involved in and all the volatile situations I've been involved in, that I'm still sitting here today. It wasn't the power of the biggest weapon that I could summon. It was the power of the handshake and playing soccer with kids. I know it's very cliche to talk about, winning hearts and minds, but that stuff came about because of guys like those on this panel who are focused on affecting spaces based on the cultural dynamics that you're walking into and not your own dynamics. So it was my last stint in the Navy was in Afghanistan. It was extremely fun. The Green Berets that were in charge of all of Uruzgan province needed someone to go and do some cultural studies. It was a big part of SOCOM's requirement for Uruzgan province, Afghanistan. And so I got the lucky task of hanging out with a bunch of Green Berets who were originally from Bangladesh and never been in Afghanistan, who spoke the language throughout Southeast Asia. It was their first push into Afghanistan. And here I was with this pen and paper asking all these questions in these Taliban strongholds, and we never got shot at. We did a bunch of really cool projects that cost us pretty much nothing. We were able to establish district governors and chief of police, train local nationals in the police side and the military side. And, it's kind of a bad taste in my mouth that we left as abruptly as we did. But that's just my own personal opinion. I think when you establish yourself and you think about Bosnia, the war ended in '96. They still vote for 3 governors, or 3 presidents, I mean. And that situation is still dynamic. We still have NATO. But yet, when you consider Afghanistan and Iraq and the sub-Saharan Africa region where you're trying to establish yourself, you start programs and you leave within 3 years. You establish nothing. You leave the bad taste in the mouth. And all they remember is colonization. And this is something that they've told me, not me making this stuff up. It's just, it was nice to walk in and have them spell this out for me as a person of color. And I'm originally from Guam. We were a Spanish colony, if you don't know, taken over by Japan, liberated by Americans. And so anything John F. Kennedy I was in love with. Anything you told me to do as a military member, I was ready to do. When you walk into those kind of situations and you see things from their lens, it's a really striking correlation between like where I come from versus what I was put into. And so Jesse and I left the Navy, started Institute for Management of Conflict. Through that, we have a contract in Philippines. And while it was a conservation for the pangolin mammal, was one of the most trafficked mammals in the world. We were training them on how to use weapons and mobility, how to navigate terrain. One of the members of the government asked us if we can come back and train them against traffickers who are kidnapping girls from those towns and sending them to Cambodia and Thailand and never to be seen again. And so I became infatuated with this phenomenon of human trafficking, and that's how Reliance came to be. And when you look at human trafficking space today, most of those organizations that do human trafficking, I take nothing away from, other than they deal with advocacy and they deal with awareness. They let you know it's a problem. Over the last decade, when you look at the situation in its entirety, what it really requires is the capabilities that we've given governments over the last 2 decades of training and advisement in order to affect that space. When you're poor, nobody cares about you. This is the way most of the poor population thinks about. In Bangladesh alone, 10% of the population when they're born is registered as ever being born. So when you become of age enough where you're trafficked and no one cares and you're trafficked, who then is going to come in and pull you out of those dark situations? And so that's why we took on the task. I think it's an important task. It's a capability that U.S. government spent years doing in the creation of us. And that's what I intend to do until I stop breathing. So that's me in a nutshell. I'll leave it to Jesse to talk about IMC and our contracts in Sierra Leone and how it's less dark over there, I guess. Right?
Thanks, Glenn. My name's Jesse Lee. Been in the military since I was 17. Started out in the Army. Joined the SEAL teams in 2008. Got out around the same time as Glenn did, and almost immediately went over to West Africa for the Ebola response. I hadn't really seen the civilian NGO side of things, and I was kind of surprised that people had no idea what special operations do. They see movies, and they just have these notions that it's just really kinetic, fast-paced, thriller-type experiences, and that's probably 2% of what Army, Navy, SOF does. And I was excited to come here today and speak to try to show you that we're good at a lot of other things too. Really good. And I think that those other capabilities need to start being exploited as we're coming out of 15 years of war fighting in multiple continents. And you're going to have a lot of veterans kind of looking for a place in society. So I was really fortunate to get hired with an NGO that focuses on providing health care for the poorest of the poor, wherever they are. They were asked to come to Sierra Leone by the government, and they had the unrestricted funding and financial mobility to move in and combat Ebola, and then that provides a foot in the door to healthcare strengthening so you can get left of future Ebola outbreaks. They hired me. I literally used MacGyver twice in my job interview, and and then they hired me. Then I got there and they wanted me they're like, just fix stuff, and then people would get scared and leave, and then I'm like, oh no, I got to do this guy's job too. And then a lot of the things I learned through the special warfare community, such as things like key leader engagements, meeting with important stakeholders in the community. That could be an NGO or local government, or it could be traditional tribesmen. And these are all things that I was thinking about, but no one else in the organization had ever dealt with situations like that. So, yeah, we were the organization was just about kicked out of a district, and then all I did was meet up with the chief and ask him what he wanted, what were his needs, and things went smoothly from then on. A lot of my coworkers would ask me about being a SEAL, and it was really eye-opening. Just people had no idea. They ask about like GI Jane and stuff like that. It's just like, but then you tell them about the vet clinics and under 5 clinics and rebuilding a small community care center, and these are the same exact things I was doing for this organization in Sierra Leone. And people were like, well, how are you doing this so proficiently? I was like, I've been doing this for a minute. Like this is it's the slower side of things. Yeah, and with that, there's also when an organization doesn't know. It was a big rush to get in there and just start providing care. And the organization was so focused on that, they lost sight of a lot of operational stuff. I hate getting loopholed into back to the security kind of things, but it wound up being really important because they had zero plans as far as security goes. So I was able to fill those shoes. And ultimately, I wound up having like 6 jobs over the last 16 months in Sierra Leone. And recently they've asked me to come back just because it's a unique environment to work in. And generally people in special operations are very good at adapting to being comfortable being uncomfortable and adapting to things that are thrown their way. I don't have a bunch more to say about that. And I would encourage any questions that if you think you know something, like you should ask us and set the record straight for what the soft community can do for diplomacy and yeah.
So hopefully you guys are kind of getting a feel of not only the guys in the movies that are here with us, but the other 90% of what is not told. The 10% is always very, very sexy. We all get that. Action, gun, kill. But obviously, as you guys hopefully are hearing and observing, that a lot of it is really building trust between communities, whether you're in DC and it's Northeast community and Southeast, let's think local, okay? Imagine that transcribed in a global arena. And I don't care who you are, you're not going to let anybody in your house that you don't know. So think of it as a very basic humanistic thing. If I trust Glenn or Ambassador Ray or Jesse, they're more inclined to probably grab a sandwich out of my fridge than someone I don't know. And that takes time. That takes those interpersonal skills that really can't be told. And it takes those experiences and in diverse environments that you don't come off as the fake American. Or the missionary, or whatever the case. And these are all amazing professions. But I kind of want to break a little bit in the mold and have these guys kind of give the stories that they can tell, those personal stories, kind of those cool, intriguing stories, kind of to fit everything as you're continuing to listen into a mold. So you guys kind of see a ground view of what they've done. These guys have amazing stories, and I just want to kind of give an opportunity to kind of give, a personal story of how your work impacted not only how you see the world right now in front of you guys, but how it impacts while you are in country. So whoever would like to go first, I give deference to the ambassador.
Well, yeah, I would sort of like to follow in what both of these gentlemen were saying about what our jobs really are. I mean, just as if you watch the movies and watch TV, you really don't have a clue what SOF or even the regular Army does. For example, war movies, I never watch them anymore. I started out in the Army as a radio operator back in 1961, 2, whatever, forgotten. And so whenever I watch a war movie and some guy on the radio says, "This is Bravo 6, over and out," I just turn the TV off and walk away. Because that's about how realistic they are. Well, the same thing is true of diplomats. If the movies, I can promise you have never seen a movie or a TV show that accurately portrays what diplomats do. We don't. Yeah, we do go to a lot of receptions and what look like social functions, but let me tell you, when you have to go, when you have to work a 14-hour day, go home, wash your face, put on a coat and tie, and go spend 4 hours making small talk with a bunch of really boring people until about 10 o'clock at night, and then go home and try and remember the 1 or 2 useful facts that you picked up to put them in a report to Washington first thing the next morning, that is not fun. There is no social events in the diplomatic world are anything but social. They are work. But what people don't realize is that the function, and I'll just talk about American diplomats, but it's true of diplomats of any country. The function of a diplomat, first and foremost, our primary mission is to protect American citizens who are living, traveling, or working in the countries where we're assigned. That's the first thing. That's our first mission. And then after that, to carry out all of the other 50, 60 to 150 tasks that flow out of Washington on an hourly basis, to include maintaining the relationship between our two countries, not necessarily being friendly with. We have embassies and diplomats in countries that are I spent a good bit of time in countries as an American diplomat, and the governments weren't very happy with us most of the time. But your job's not to go there and necessarily make friends, but to maintain relationships and maintain contacts, to be able to explain to people in Washington what's going on in that country so that they can make, hopefully, informed decisions back here, and to interpret for the people in that country what is going on here, what our policies are and what they mean. Those are the main things that diplomats do. The aid function, we get involved with that, but even there is, we give a lot of, and I'm not talking about Ebola, humanitarian issues are a completely different breed. We act in times of crisis to help keep people alive or to help save lives, but we do a lot of aid that has really nothing to do with saving lives. We dig wells, we build schools, we build bridges. Don't build bridges so much anymore since the end of the Cold War, but we do a lot of things that don't have anything directly to do with curing a disease or saving a life, and they are all ultimately aimed at building that relationship with that country and its people for our benefit. Down the road, I mean, it sounds selfish, but it's a fact. Countries don't do things for other countries because they like them. They do things for other countries because they will get some benefit from it. That's what it's all about. And I remember the story during when I was sort of a mid-level, well, a junior diplomat. When George Shultz was Secretary of State, he had a practice that I thought was really instructive for people who are representing the U.S. abroad, whether they're in civilian clothing or uniform. Every ambassador, before he departed for post, would be invited for a meeting with Shultz in his office. He had this big old globe near his desk. And Shultz would ask the new ambassador near the end of the meeting to go over to the globe and point out his country. And the poor fool who would go over and twist that globe to find the country he was heading to and put his finger on it would find 240 pounds of Schultz breathing down his neck, slapping his hand away, repositioning the globe, putting that big hand of his over the United States and said, hell no, that's your country and don't you ever forget it. And that's something you have to keep in mind when you're reading about what diplomats and what soldiers do. We work for the people of the United States. Every soldier and every diplomat takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that's what we do. He wanted a story about the odd things that we do that are interesting and that people don't often know about. I was appointed ambassador to Cambodia. Went in 2002. In the wake of 9/11, everyone's focus was on terrorism. Every embassy in the world had to have a plan for how to make Muslims like us. Go figure. We just decided in 2001 that we wanted some people in the world to like us. And so the goodies that flow out of the budget offices here naturally went to the embassies that had large Muslim populations to deal with. You know, you wanted extra money, you better have a significant Muslim population or you got ignored a lot. Cambodia. How many of you know anything about Cambodia? What would you say the Muslim population of Cambodia is? What percentage? 5%. But you know about as much about it as people in Washington did when I went out, because when I informed them that the Cham Muslims of Cambodia accounted for about 5% of the population, that we had been ignoring them since we reestablished relations with the country, and that they didn't particularly like us, it hit Washington as a big surprise. Bigger surprise when I informed them. And the reason they don't like us is because when we bombed Cambodia during the incursion in 1969, was it? Guess whose villages were under most of those bombs? The Cham, because they are the ones who occupied that stretch of country that we went through. So their view of the United States was, these are the guys that fly over, drop bombs, and go home. And now they have an embassy in Phnom Penh, and they talk to the Khmer, but they never come to our villages. We get none of the aid that they're giving to the country. Needless to say, they didn't like us very much. We also discovered, for some reason no one had ever checked, that the Jemaah Islamiyah, which is the extremist Islamic group in Indonesia, which at that time everyone was saying was an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, was proselytizing the Chams in Cambodia to a fare thee well. I mean, they had JI operatives all over the place. They were also conducting surveillance of the U.S. and British embassies, planning a nice surprise for us. And they were planning to send trucks through the gate and blow the places up. We foiled that thanks to a riot that wasn't planned. Happenstance, the Cambodian students got mad at the Thai government and burned their embassy down, so the borders got closed and it cut off a terrorist attack. That's how these things work sometimes. But on the other, when I went to Washington with this information and asked for a few $1,000s, $50,000, $60,000 to start a program to reach out to the Cham Muslim community, at first I was rebuffed because the answer back was, it's an insignificant community. And when we finally provided the statistics, it's like flutter. We managed to put together a $30,000 English language scholarship program, which we offered to Cham Muslim students to help them improve their English so that they could get student visas to study abroad. Within 9 months, that entire community, very tight-knit community, small, 5% of the population in Cambodia is not a highly, thanks to the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia doesn't have a large population. The attitude toward the U.S. within 9 months went from 75% unfavorable to about 85% favorable on a $30,000 investment. And that's what our diplomats do. And I will say too that part of the help we got on that also was from the military. I had I've forgotten what they call them, these teams that come in and build bridges and schools. Anyway, engineers. Well, sometimes they were engineers, sometimes I know they weren't, but they did a good job. Huh? Something like that, yeah. I don't remember what they called them. We had a CB team come in once. I mean, it'd be different groups, but hey, I didn't ask for ID cards. I mean, if these guys came in to build a school or build a bridge, I would cut the ribbon and thank them, and we'd have a party, and hey, everyone's happy. Building bridges to places that had no way to, during the rainy season, had no way to get out of their villages. But it's this type of activity that never makes the papers, that never gets a movie made about it, is what we do on a daily basis. I mean, this is, it doesn't sound sexy, but this is what all of us do 24/7, 365 days a year.
And I just want to share like two quick stories. Like in Iraq, the special forces guys we trained originally were Shia. We didn't know anything about the Sunni-Shia divide. So we walked them from Baghdad all the way to Anbar. And the first interrogatee that we get, I'm like, why are you killing your own? He's like, Shia, it's not Sunni. Like, what do you want me to do? He's like, create a Sunni army. Like, this is crazy. So we created a Sunni army that led to, if you guys remember, we said no former Ba'athist Party member was going to be part of parliament or anything in government. Those guys helped change that divide. We now had former Ba'athist guys running for parliament. That led to Zarqawi eventually getting killed because local Sunnis didn't like Jordanian guys coming in and making their cause an Iraqi cause. So that was one of the big blunders. And like, you know, we have to be better at understanding dynamics. Some of the things as he was saying. And the other one was, if y'all are familiar with the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, it was a militant group we called terrorists who were all over the Nigerian Delta states who were kidnapping. The big one was 24 Filipinos off a Chevron platform. I think it was. You know, this was me and Majiguri talking to them and asking them to tell me why they're not a terrorist organization. And they're, you know, quick to say, hey, look, an American company comes in and extracts oil, and they've been doing it for decades. And if you're saying it's the equivalent of Exxon Valdez spill every year, how do you think I'm going to fish, and how do you think I'm going to commit to agriculture? And so I really had nothing to say to the guy other than we'll try and do something about it. So we write this intel report, goes up the chain. State Department puts an embargo on everything humanitarian, but leaves oil as something that they can extract and sell. And do you think I'm going back to the Niger Delta to talk to these guys? No. Because what I promised them was we were going to make a change, and what we did was removed everything that the poverty-stricken areas are depending on and kept the corruption and the oil extraction at full force. And so these are kinds of things that, you know, you ask guys like us to go and understand and write reports about. And, you know, it's kind of scary to think that you're going to ask me to go back into these areas and have these conversations when what I promised originally was an understanding and a change to what we're doing, and then we don't do it. So those are like the two biggest blunders I think I've ever had in my career. Like, I would never walk back. I'd go back to Iraq any day, but you know, the Niger Delta states, it's gotten better. I think Chevron's got a really good program in the Partnership for the Initiative of Niger Delta. Chevron puts a lot of money into it, and I think they're a very good model for what comes out if you're an American corporation and you're exercising corporate social responsibility. they're a very good example, and this is just from the experience I had while I was hanging out in sub-Saharan Africa, going out, comparing and contrasting, our policies versus local policies, what they think versus what we think, and it's really it's really scary to think that we are looking out for our own interest. As an American, I'm very proud, but to think that you're looking out for your own interest when you look at these poverty-stricken areas that are suffering from some of the things that our corporations do, it's pretty scary. It had nothing to do with the military. It was just something they were asked to go do because it was extremely volatile at the time. But those things are really eye-opening, and I think we take that to everything that we do today. It's a complete understanding, and we need to have some kind of paradigm shift when it comes to humanitarian aid versus what we choose to extract from countries as a commodity, and how we go about doing that and exercising some responsibility and invigorating their economic development versus our own. Coming from the developing world and living with these poverty-stricken areas and building up governance and good governance and talking about human rights and all this jazz, it's pretty scary to think that we're one of those that contribute to the destabilization of some areas because of our interest. And then we're trying to fix it by sending in guys like us. And, I've lost a lot of friends and I can't quite swallow that pill. And so I think that's why we exist. I think that's why we want to do what we do. And that's one of the reasons this panel is we go above and beyond what we're asked to do. And there's a different understanding from where we are versus a diplomatic point of view versus a policy point of view in the State Department. You get guys in the Hill who go and do these codels, hang out in the country, never leave the city centers. Their understanding is a city center. It doesn't speak to the frontier. It doesn't speak to poverty-stricken areas. And so I think we need to just rethink how we approach some of these communities that we're trying to affect. And I think that's why a lot of you guys are here, is trying to hear some of our stories and how you guys would make some of the things better. So I'll just stop talking now.
I guess it's my turn for a story. Back to Ebola times in Sierra Leone. The district I got sent to was the worst hit district for Ebola. People wouldn't even go there. They would drive through town with their windows up. And the World Health Organization classified the hospital in the area as the worst healthcare facility in the country. And they were ready to pull funding for everything except for the Ebola treatment centers in the district. The donors didn't want anyone there because it was too dangerous. The hospital didn't like any of the organizations that were working there. They felt like we came in and took over and were telling them what to do and weren't listening. Like they weren't stakeholders themselves. And I got there and immediately recognized that there needed to be these key leader engagements. There had to be ownership. And the NGO just completely inexperienced at dealing with the diplomacy, even inside it was a 200-bed hospital. And, with that, is an American and working for an international NGO, you inherently are a diplomat. You're a representation of the United States and that organization. So it was really important for me to navigate the inner workings of this hospital and get them to invite us to do work and allow us to get funding to rebuild this hospital that was just devastated by a decade of civil war and then corrupt government, and then Ebola. So just simply by talking with them and asking them and doing all the things that would keep me safe downrange, like having a relationship with the community, and it's just like a mirror image, except you're not holding a gun. You're writing reports to get funding to rebuild a hospital, and within 8 months, just by having a weekly meeting with the hospital administration, spending time playing soccer with the kids, we were invited to do work at this hospital, and 8 months after the WHO declared it the worst, most dangerous healthcare facility in the country, it was reclassified as one of the best healthcare facilities in the country. And it was basically me asking them, what do you need? And being able to operate and navigate some of the policies and feelings of the local government, local tribes, and the people that worked in these facilities. So it was a really good granular, like I could see the whole thing happening. It was almost like I jokingly treated it as like a counterinsurgency, me against the hospital administration, which was making it really difficult to do any work in the district. But through doing projects that they wanted, we were able to give and take and do some really great things for the district, to get radiology and a lot of things that have never been there before. The end.
Before we do whatever David has next on the program, I wanted to address something that was said here, the bit about identifying a need and then being told by someone in Washington to do something that completely turned it on its ear. And that's an important thing to focus on, because I mean, as a diplomat for 30 years, I can't really remember the number of times that I've either received instructions or suggestions from Washington to do something that, being the guy on the ground, I looked at and saw as being really, really stupid. And not necessarily just because it hurt the people there, but because in the long run, while it might give us a short-term gain, it would come back to bite us at some time in the future. After I retired in 2012, I actually spent some time doing some research to try and figure out why this was that we sometimes, and again, thankfully you don't read about a lot of this in the paper because it's not that sexy, but why we persist diplomatically in shooting ourselves in the foot, reloading and taking aim again just constantly. And what I found was quite interesting. Started with a paper written by Jeffrey Wiseman, professor at USC, who describes the distinct characteristics of American diplomacy, or what he calls American anti-diplomacy, that really is part of our historical and cultural DNA. After about a year or two of research, I ended up putting together a syllabus and teaching 2 semesters of the history of American diplomacy at Johns Hopkins last year. And what it amounts to sort of explain what you were just told here, is that, and people don't realize this country did not have a career or professional diplomatic corps of people abroad to look out for American interests until 1924. We didn't send our first ambassador abroad until 1893. When the country was founded, the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, determined that the free America had no need of diplomats, only a few commercial consuls to look out for American mercantile interests. And so from the founding of the Republic until 1924, well, from the founding of the Republic until 1893, senior Americans sent abroad were, one, politically connected with the office, the party that won the election, and wealthy, and amateurs. I mean, basically, we had no ambassadors. We used the title minister, which is the rank just below ambassador, because it was felt that an ambassador was too closely associated with the royal government or the monarchies of Europe, and we were having none of that. Late 1800s, when we realized that in no capital where we had a minister were they ever listened to, where they ever had any clout, because the ambassador of the smallest country on the planet got in ahead of our minister. That's the way protocol works. That's the way diplomatic protocol works. So in 1893, we sent the first ambassador abroad. Until 1924, though, they were still all people who were politically connected. Not just the ambassadors. Our consuls, the guys who stamped visas and who took care of seamen who in their ports and did commercial work, were also political amateurs, people with political connections. The guys who typed the dispatches in the embassies were amateurs. They were the sons, not daughters. We didn't have any female diplomats until, the 1900s. They were the sons of wealthy people who could afford to send their children abroad to lollygag around Europe and other places for a year or two and enjoy themselves. 1924, Congress passed the first Foreign Service Act, created the U.S. Diplomatic Service, combined the consuls and the diplomats into one. They still didn't send career types overseas as ambassadors until probably the very late 20s. And you hear, if you've seen in the papers, the big argument over the number of political ambassadors versus career ambassadors, and I think now it's running like 70-30, 70% career, 30% political. Well, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it was 70-30 the other way, 30% career and 70% bigwigs who were politically connected. So there's that. The other is there's this mistrust and misunderstanding of diplomacy as a pursuit. It is not trusted by our politicians. It's not trusted by our senior political leaders. And it's not well understood by the average American, just what a diplomat is and what do diplomats do. And we, at all levels, to include a few people I've known in senior positions in the Department of State and in the White House, don't see the distinction between policy and practice. We constantly confuse foreign policy and diplomacy, and they are different. Foreign policy is to diplomacy what strategic plans are to attacking a hill. I mean, you do strategic plans, you give it to some unit, and when the firing starts, they throw the plan in the back of the truck and they do what they have to do to survive. And that's, fortunately, after a civil war, the military is allowed to do that. Our diplomats still are not. We still get instructions from Washington, not always from the State Department, by the way. Quite often the State Department simply relaying a message from the White House or Congress to do things that are completely wrong-headed and counterproductive in the long term. But we are a short-term culture. We are a culture where the people at the top change at a minimum every 6, 4, or 2 years. And so after every election, you got a new playbook. You got to do things a different way. Not only do they craft the policy that tells you what they want you to achieve, but then they get on the phone or they go to their computer terminal and they send you an email and they tell you precisely how they want you to achieve it. You know, it's like a coach telling his quarterback something and then running out to the field at the snap and running behind him telling him how to play the game. The other factor that is unique in the way we as Americans conduct diplomacy is that we are very fond of direct action. We're very impatient people. Diplomacy is the art of developing and maintaining long-term relationships. And so you go and you sit across the table from someone and you spend a lot of time getting to know them and letting them get to know you and trying to achieve what that particular negotiating session is intended for, while at the same time trying to maintain the relationship that will go out beyond that. We Americans don't do that very well. I mean, we get talking points. We go in, we sit at the table, we whip out our talking points, and we drive the other side crazy because we immediately start reading our talking points. And they're sitting there blinking like, what happened to tea? And yeah, good morning. It's nice to meet you too. I mean, that's not far from how it actually happens. It's amazing how we manage to succeed in negotiations as often as we do because of the way we approach it. And that's what leads to situations like he described. And until more people like you who aren't part of the problem yet, there's your students, learn about, one, sort of how we look at things as opposed to how things actually are, and spread that information around. What are our long-term interests and how are we, in fact, failing to achieve those long-term interests on a daily basis? We're going to keep getting situations where you go back and say, hey, you know, if we built that bridge, they wouldn't be so aggressive with us, and get instructions back saying, blow the bridge up and go get some more oil. Yeah? Anyway.
Thank you, everybody, for all your words of wisdom. My name is Dave Wostocki. I actually work on corruption mapping at the Carnegie Endowment with Sarah Chase, if any of you are familiar with her. Glenn, my question is for you. You talked about in the Nigerian Delta about the situation with Exxon. Did you ever investigate why that decision was made? And can you share some of what happened?
It's never been my job to investigate or question government policy, but I think the moral of the story was for me that you asked me to go and pull out information that will allow you to make policies effective as much as possible, and rather than articulate to the Italian Esso, which is Exxon, and Dutch Shell, who was there, and the American Chevron company, rather than articulate to them that they have to hold responsibility, they did it in a very small way publicly But the Chevron and all the other companies were like, it's the government's problem. We give them money; they should filter down social development, and that never took place. And so I think Chevron that I mentioned was a good example of the PIND, Partnership for the Initiative of Niger Delta. They now do aquaponics in catfish farming. They took on raising corn to feed that fish. They now have jumped into the palm oil and cassava industries. However, when they did it, they didn't realize how fast you had to get a lot of those products to market, and they didn't really develop the market. Their whole idea was to develop it locally so they can actually do stuff with it, but they didn't really identify the market, and so they're working on that now. But at the time when I was there and we had questions and we reported this, what are the results that we see come out in the news, and we're just a bunch of guys sitting in a rundown building somewhere laughing and like, are you serious? Totally not what we said in the report, that they should put sanctions on the oil because it leads to the corruption and the 36 governors that get the money for that, and they should be required to do something socially, some percentage of that, something. And so it was really defeating to see that. But we're just guys were asked to go do a different mission, and my job was living in N'Djamena, training special forces on the Chadian side to go to Darfur and stop the rebels from taking UN vehicles and burning warehouses down. And then we were asked to do the sidebar situation and go talk to people who are part of the MEND and understand why it is they're doing what they're doing. And when you sit down and talk to them, they're like, we took 24 Filipinos. Did we hurt them? No. We got $1.2 million for them, and we'll do it again. And it was the corporation paying that money, and of course they're going to do it again. They're not hurting them. I like that they're not hurting them, but at the same time, you have to think like, well, I would do it too if I was a desperate man living in that state where I can't fish, take care of my kids. Gas flaring was an issue for at least a decade. People were getting sick from it. They didn't understand what gas flaring was. And you sit by and you listen to this story, I would be desperate too. And so did I call them a terrorist? No, in the report we're like, they're not terrorists. They're guys who have had basic life necessities taken from them, and they made their mark because you sent me there to have this conversation. And so you've heard them. And so now what are you going to do about it? Oh, sanctions on humanitarian aid. It's ridiculous. And so you can't ask me to go back and have the same conversation with the same guy after I promised him that things would change. So it's one story that's a little sour in my experience because you sit across from a guy and you have a conversation about something and you can relate to that, and you can't do anything about it. So it's not my question to question government. It's just my job to go and collect and report and then hope that we'll make the right decision. And in that case, we didn't.
If it's possible I'm curious if it's possible if that humanitarian aid had some trouble reaching the right place, if that may have been, something that contributed to what happened.
I mean, I really think that it wasn't anything about humanitarian aid not reaching these communities. It was more so, if I'm bringing you rice and some sustenance and you're eating and living from it, but then I removed everything that would allow long-term sustainability, which is agriculture and fishing, you really solved nothing. And so that was the argument. They weren't mad that we were giving them things, and they weren't mad that organizations were involved in bringing them some sustenance. The argument was, you ruined my entire life, and you have no way of determining whether or not that life is going to come back. Not for me, but for my children. And so these are regular people who have a conversation with you. I've never met them before, and I've never ever had any issue with that ethnicity, the Ijaw, nothing. And here they are explaining to me in very simple terms what those corporations have done to their community. And so we're very good at packaging aid when you hear that there's something like Rwanda or et cetera that have come about in any part of the world. That's not the problem. The problem is long-term sustainment and what you have removed from that community that you can never take back. That's the result. And the UN had said that every year the equivalent to the Exxon Valdez is spilled in these fisheries and in this agriculturally strongholds. How do you fix that? That's my job was to report, and my job was to say that based on what you tell me, we're going to adjust the way we view humanitarian aid, and that's totally not what took place. So we're good with respect to, Americans love hearing about stories. We're doing a toy drive for IDPs after the Boko Haram incident in Nigeria, and that's where I'll be at the end of the year. We're very good at boxing stuff up and sending it. It's not the solution. The solution is building up what you took from them. That's the solution. And sometimes it's as simple as what Jesse put. It's asking the question. And we don't ask the question. We just think that we're there to do great things, and we have our own agendas, and things don't transpire as you expect them to. And then you ask guys like us to go out and understand these dynamics, and then we're back to square one. So.
You were saying that in terms of fixing this, that the solution is this mutual understanding. In your definition and brand of cultural diplomacy, what do you consider your greatest success story? Because that sounds like the opposite, perhaps, in your view. What do you consider one of your greatest successes in terms of the cultural diplomacy?
One of the things that we didn't understand when we were running around Afghanistan was why the Kuchi tribes would run away from us every time we showed up somewhere. And so I hopped on an ATV and chased them when they were moving up on the higher ground. And I was with an interpreter. I was like, why do you guys keep running every time we show up? And they said to me that when we show up, we create fighting between Talibs and Americans, and that we have changed the way they do trade. So when they come from the Peshawar regions and they come with spices, they trade the spices for textiles or whatever it might be. And so when we were coming into those regions, we were changing the way they trade. And their cycle of winter, summer, spring, we were affecting that, like in a very bigger scale than we actually thought. And so through that, I don't know. I thought it was a very good idea at the time, but I thought it was dumb, but it actually worked out. I was like, we were talking about building a center for the Pashto, who they were trading with, to have girls go to school who were Kuchi during the summer. And when they left for the winter, they could use it for whatever administrative building. I was just making stuff up. And they actually agreed to it. And it was weird that now the Pashto were like, can we send our girls to school? And I didn't really consider that. I was just like, why not? It's up to you whether you want to send them to school, but I would just tell you. And I was just naming off very powerful women in the United States who are very successful, and the reasons why having a woman in power was critical to their development, period. And I happened to have an American Afghan who spoke Pashto, Dari, Farsi, and English, who was really attractive, talking to them. And they thought, and I was like, why can't you have the same thing here? And then it was just like bright-eyed Bush to like, it's a great idea. So now you had, and here's the bad part. So we create this system of educating both the Pashto girls and the Kuchi girls in business. It was basic. It was talking about trade and the history of trade. It wasn't math and science and English. It wasn't any of that. It was just whatever they want to teach them. The Quran was part of that situation. It was great. But we're no longer there. So what was the result of that program? I can't tell you. But it was a success, in my viewpoint, that you're able to have them agree to something that they've never, ever done before. And it wasn't me telling them to do it because it was great for them. It was just giving them an example of how our society has become. The fact that I'm brown, the fact that I had a woman interpreter from Santa Barbara, California, who was Afghan, with Pashto and Dari, mom and dad, who were not both Pashto. That resonated very well with them. And so it was, before that, and then before that mission, it was me walking into the interpreter's tent, like just kind of as an idiot saying, "Who speaks Pashadari and Farsi and is a female?" And they were like, and the girl was like, "I do." And she's never been in the field. I'm like, "You cool with riding an MV and like doing all this stuff?" She's like, "Not really, but I'll go." And I'm like, "You're my girl." And like, we went and did these, I had her do meetings with women, and like I empowered her to do that. And I didn't sit in any of that. And all these conversations took place, and these projects were developed. And I'll just give you an idea of our budget. Every team that was in the Uruzgan province had a $50,000 op budget, and then you had a budget that you can request through CJSOTF, like Commander Joint Special Operations Task Force. But with $50,000 or less, like if anything was below $25,000, we needed no permission. So most of those projects were well below those. There were mud bricks, it was them building it. You run into instances where you buy them concrete and they're like, "How much are you going to pay me to lay the concrete?" Like, "What do you mean I bought you the concrete to improve your house?" And they're like, "Yeah, but how much are you going to pay for it?" I'm like, "I'm not going to pay you to improve your own house. And I bought you the masonry and stuff. And like, I'm going to help you." And like, "Yeah." And they're looking at you like, "No, seriously, how much are you going to pay me?" I'm like, "This is ridiculous." And so we just started helping them out and building stuff up. And they realized we're never going to pay them. And they just jumped in. I was like, it was absurd to me, and I didn't want to argue with him that I wasn't going to pay him. I just wanted to improve his situation. And you just do those things, and you start. It's kind of like being a leader, or you in any situation in your life. If you start putting out a hammer to nail, it's like someone's going to jump in and help you out. And it's not a reason of whether you're going to pay me or not. It's just like, yeah, I see someone who needs a little bit of help, I'll help them out. It's a human condition, and from an intelligence mindset, I played on those conditions all the time. And it always worked well for me. But that's probably the biggest success, I think. And even with refugees in Bosnia, this is a farming community. They were resettled in a almost Serb Bosniak stronghold. And, playing on the reasons why they came there, and like me guilt-tripping the Serbs to let them stay. It's probably too much of a strong move to do that, but they allowed them to do it. And they were there for at least 6 years that I know of, and thank God Facebook exists. I'm friends with them now on Facebook. I wouldn't think that refugees would have access to Facebook, but they did for some reason. And but I mean, it's great to see those situations grow, and the Bosnian situation I was involved with exhuming mass grave sites from the Srebrenica massacre, and eventually Mladic being tried for war crimes. I mean, it took years for us to do that. This is day in and day out having conversations with Serbs who felt bad about those atrocities and had conversations about where those locations are, because people wanted their family members back. I mean, I can bore you and go on, but it's at the end of the day, it's about them connecting with you and them seeing how it's going to make their life better. And it has nothing to do with me. At the end of the day, I'm not living there. So it's anyways, stop talking.
Look. Okay, this is a question for the ambassador. It's unintended consequences. I wondered about your story about in Cambodia. You said you helped the small minority of Muslims there. If their reputation is similar to the Muslims in like Thailand and Myanmar, there's a lot of conflict between them and the larger majority. Wondered if that happened there, particularly if they're making contacts with Indonesian terrorist groups like Islam Jamila.
No, actually, and I still have contacts there. There was no, there was no conflict between the Muslim community and the Khmer. I mean, they were basically just a marginalized, completely overlooked 5% of the population, mostly fishermen and farmers. The Cham Muslims are not.
My main question was, what if the U.S. is aiding them? What does that say to the marginalized
Well, I mean, first of all, they weren't potential terrorist elements. They were being the JI was attempting to proselytize. Let me go back and sort of put it in a bit better context. In Cambodia, which suffered a real trauma during the Khmer Rouge period, where basically everybody was victimized, they can go from full-on violence to being the most gentle, easygoing people in the world, and just like that. Basically, the Cham are easygoing. I mean, if you go into a Cham village prior to back in the 60s and 50s, they were basically pastoral people, fishermen, live and let live. They'd have a mosque in the village. You didn't see women wearing the hijab. I mean, it was really just, it was sort of like Sierra Leonean Muslims. I mean, very, very laid back. When the Wahhabis actually came in to try and proselytize before JI did. I mean, Saudis. They were able to convince probably 15–20% of the population to follow their more strict brand of Islam, to the point where by 2002, when I arrived in Cambodia, you'd go into a Cham village and you would often find 2 mosques, because the people who were following the more strict form wouldn't even go to the same mosque as they had been going to before. They were not really buying into the whole jihad, suicide thing. It was more of just trying to bring a more strict form of Islam into their communities, having the women wear head coverings and not having the boys and girls going to the same school. I mean, you go into some of these places and the village school up to a certain level would be boys and girls together. That's how laid back it was. There was really little conflict between the Cham community and the Cambodian government because, frankly, everybody in Cambodia except the few rich crooks at the top of the pile were poor. I mean, the average Cambodian wasn't getting along that well either. I mean, there was no... Well, because the larger majority was already getting... I mean, here's a point you have to understand. By the time I arrived, we were already providing aid to Cambodia. None of that aid was filtering down into Cham communities. So the Khmer were getting aid. They were getting assistance, the HIV programs, they were getting educational support, other medical things. What was not happening is that when you went into rural Cham villages, none of that aid money filtered into their villages. So all I did was get a little extra pot of money. I mean, the amount they got, my aid budget in Cambodia in 2003 was about, I think it was $30 million. The amount I spent on the Cham was $30,000 US. I mean, nobody's going to complain. That's not even an account. And it made them friends. Yeah, and here's just to give you an example that I also included government officials in the program, and so I would go to a Muslim school or a Muslim village and say give out books or notebooks and pencils, things that kids needed. I would always take a government minister with me. There is a sort of a formulaic way of making speeches that the Cambodian politicians do. They do their speech and they always end it with, and I wish you the 5 Buddhist blessings, and it goes, long life and whatever. I went to a Muslim school to give out books to a boys' school, and the Cambodian Minister for Islamic Affairs, who himself was Muslim, accompanied me. I do my little speech, and the boys are all listening, and he gets up, and he's telling them how it's so nice. The American ambassador, he's come, and he's given us these books, and we really need them, World Atlas and notebooks. And he goes on in his speech, and I'm sitting there half drowsy. I didn't wake up until the very end of his speech when it's, you got to remember, I'm the only non-Muslim in the room. He ended his speech with, "And I wish you all the 5 Buddhist blessings." And not an eye batted. I mean, it's that type of a culture. What our program did was to highlight that you had people coming in from outside actually trying to drive a wedge, and it just took being able, also after when the Cambodians, the Khmer members of government saw the positive impacts of this and the fact that you had a community that despite being marginalized was not angry, was not striking out, they started pushing some tiny bits of government aid their way. So in the end, what really wound up happening, not only did we change the Cham Muslim attitude toward the U.S., but we changed the dynamic between the Cham communities and the Khmer communities. And it's not just Buddhist, because all Chams are not Muslims. I mean, you had some Cham who are Buddhist, you have some who are animist. About 5% of the population, though, are Cham Muslims. They were finally feeling that they were being made a part of the larger society. The larger society, we had other issues with them. We're perfectly willing to accept that, because it was nothing. I wasn't taking away from them to give. I was looking for extra resources to add to what we were already doing. Okay.
I'll stand up so you can see me. Yes, good. All right. My name's Tyler Vandenberg. I'm a senior at American University studying foreign policy national security. We've heard a lot today about winning hearts and minds as a concept, sort of indirectly and directly as far as seeing what we can do for the peoples on the ground. Famously, winning hearts and minds is a concept that dates back almost 50 years, and though I'd ask the question directly to the ambassador, it's open to all 3 of you. What's the biggest change you've seen in the way we execute these sorts of operations on the ground in your own careers?
First of all, I hate that phrase. I hate it with a passion. I mean, I hated it. I hated it when it was dumped in my lap in Vietnam in the 60s. I don't like it anymore today. I don't think our objective should be to win hearts and minds. Our objectives should be to gain understanding, mutual understanding. Our objective should be truth. We go into these poor countries, and it's a fallacy to think that because people are poor that they're stupid. They're not. They're pretty smart. They know, because they're looking out for number one, and they know darn well that what we do is not out of the great goodness of our heart, but that we're doing, that we get something out of it. My operating assumption is that if I walk up to you and I tell you, going in, this is what I want, this is what I'm prepared to do, I'm prepared to respect you as long as you're prepared to respect me. I'm not going to lie to you. You might not like half of what I say, but I'm going to tell you the truth. That you then build a relationship that you get what you want out of it and they get what they want out of it. So how is it different today than it ever was? I think the big difference is that when the Soviet Union fell, I mean, we were like a boat that just got cut loose from its moorings and we're floating and not sure where we were heading. We no longer had a clear focus on why we were doing what we were doing. I mean, at least during the Cold War, while it might have not been the best way of looking at it, at least you knew you were doing this to hold off the Soviets. I've had a problem from the beginning with the war on terror. I mean, how in the hell you can conduct a war on a concept I have yet to figure out. I don't mind waging war against terrorists. I'm even happy to go after extremists, but I have a little bit of difficulty conducting warfare on a concept. And to me, that I think is the biggest weakness. When you are when you're focusing, when you're crafting it in those terms, you leave yourself open to how you define, what's the definition of terror? I mean, we know what the dictionary definition is, but when you're dealing with a population, we were talking, for instance, about the Niger Delta. I mean, the guy who's hungry, whose fields are soaked in oil and he can no longer grow crops, does not think of himself as a terrorist when he blows up a refinery. He thinks of himself as a pissed off farmer who's getting back, who's striking back. So that's the problem I have with that. I mean, you can wage war on a country, you can even wage war on a people. But when you have this amorphous concept that is defined differently by different people, then you can't be winning hearts and minds, because in order to win minds, you've got to be thinking in the same language. And when I say terror, you have to know exactly what I mean, or our minds are. I'm never going to win your mind, because our minds are not anywhere in the same universe. And I think that's where we went off, is rather than sit down and do the hard work of defining just exactly what our hard, concrete interests are, short, medium, and long term, and what we had to do to achieve them, and what we would have to give up in order to achieve them, we come up with a phrase, a soundbite, a slogan, and then we open the gate and we're off and running like at the Preakness. I think, I'll tell one more story and I'll let one of these guys go. When I was getting ready to go to Cambodia, I was getting ready to retire, and they called me at my job at the Pentagon and said, would you consider taking one more job before you go? And I said, yes. And when they told me where it was, and I said, okay, I'll take it, but here's the deal. I don't do regime change. I don't vote in their elections. I don't care who leads them. Tell me what our interests are and what resources you're giving me to achieve those interests, and I'll go do the job. Screw with me and I retire. You can do that when you're, they can't hold your next job over you. And so I left my job at the Pentagon. I took a week off because I had been on the road. At that point, I think I'd been on the road for like 3 straight months, and I'd promised my wife some time with her. And I went to the Department of State, and I walked into the Africa Bureau, and I said, brief me, please, on our interests, our policy in the country that I'm being nominated for. And I got blank stares. And then I get these phrases, oh, well, we're supporting the opposition to get rid of Mugabe. And I said, no. I don't want to know what we're doing. I want to know what our policy is. What are our interests? I know what we're doing. I want to know why we're doing it. And no one could tell me, because there had not been an interagency working group meeting to determine U.S.-specific interests and policy on Zimbabwe for over 15 years. We didn't have a clear, unequivocal statement of policy. So I said, please, could I have one? Be nice when I go out. I've got a country team with like 12 agencies. I got to pull them all together. Give me a written policy, and I can always shove it in their faces. Yeah, okay. This was 2008. This was July 2009. I went to that country in November 2009. I left that country in August 2012. I still don't got that paper. So that's, if there is a difference, it's that we have a few places on the globe where we have our interests very, very clearly in mind, and we put a lot of effort. The rest of the world is like maps from the 12th century. There are a lot of blank spaces.
I just wanted to add real quick, like when you ask about what's changed, like really what the active duty side changes the way you walk into the dynamic of a certain situation, whether it's culturally or tactically, doesn't matter. But that's really what's changed. I mean, we've changed the way SEAL teams are utilized. It's more adopted into the Green Beret model of long-term sustainment and development, it's moved to that, where SEAL teams used to be what you see in the movies, a lot of kinetic episodes that we do. Bin Laden raids most recent. But now we've shifted that model and changed our organization to devote different SEAL teams to different geographic regions in the world. And the focus is language and culture, and to exact some change as we saw it in the hearts and minds thing. The whole hearts and minds speech is, to me, it sounds like everyone running for office who says Washington's broken. It's like doesn't fix it. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. But we've changed the way we've walked into communities, I think.